He opened his eyes to the sound of a heartbeat monitor. Slow, steady, alive. For the first time in 203 days, Mark Evans was awake. The doctors had said it was impossible. The nurses had whispered that his body was fading. His family had stopped hoping weeks ago. But somehow, against every odd, he came back. The light above him was blinding. His throat burned. His body felt like it belonged to someone else. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. And then, through the haze of pain, he saw her. Emily, his girlfriend, the woman who hadn't left his side since the accident. She sat in the corner of the hospital room, clutching a bouquet of wilted flowers, her eyes red and swollen from tears. When she saw his eyes open, she gasped, stood up, and whispered his name like it was a prayer. For a moment, it looked like a miracle. But miracles don't begin with fear. Because when Mark tried to speak, when he forced the air through his bruised lungs, what came out wasn't gratitude. It wasn't love. It was something else, something that froze the entire room. She tried to kill me. The nurse dropped her clipboard. Emily froze mid-step, her lips trembling. And in that chilling silence, the illusion of devotion shattered into horror. The doctors thought they were witnessing a man's recovery, but in truth, they were hearing the first words of a murder investigation. Because that night, in a quiet hospital room, the survivor had just named his attacker, and she was standing right there, pretending to love him. To everyone who knew them, Mark Evans and Emily Rhodes were the kind of couple that made love look easy. He was 32, steady, calm, the type of man who believed in hard work and quiet mornings. She was 29, bright, free-spirited, always the center of every room she walked into. They met at a charity marathon downtown. Mark was volunteering. Emily had joined to teach a pre-race yoga class. Their connection was instant, one of those storybook moments that friends later called fate. Within months, they were inseparable. Dinner dates, road trips, long walks hand in hand. Her smile lit up his world, and his devotion made her feel untouchable. Their social media told the story everyone wanted to believe. Sunset selfies, anniversary captions, and posts that read, "Forever my person." But behind the filters and hashtags, something darker was growing. Friends began to notice little changes. Mark stopped showing up to weekend gatherings. Emily grew possessive. She needed to know where he was, who he talked to, when he'd be home. At first, he brushed it off as love, maybe even concern. But soon, her questions became interrogations. Her affection turned into control. One neighbor once recalled hearing shouting from their apartment at 2 a.m. Another remembered seeing Mark leave for work one morning with a bruise under his eye. When asked about it, he laughed and said he bumped into a cabinet. But cabinets don't scream your name. Still, Mark stayed, because that's what he did. He fixed things. He believed in loyalty, in second chances. And Emily knew that. She knew he loved her enough to excuse the small things, the jealousy, the mood swings, the tears followed by apologies. What no one realized was that those small things were adding up. They were cracks in the foundation of a love story everyone thought was perfect. And every apology, every promise to change, was just another layer hiding something poisonous underneath. By the time Mark started to see the truth, it was already too late. because love wasn't the only thing Emily wanted to control. She wanted his life, his choices, and eventually his death.
It was a rainy Friday night, the kind of night when the world feels heavy and silent, when even the streetlights seem to drown in the storm. Mark Evans had been driving for nearly an hour. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up with the downpour, and thunder rolled across the sky like a warning. In the passenger seat sat Emily, quiet, arms folded, eyes fixed on the road ahead. They hadn't spoken since leaving the restaurant. What started as a simple dinner had ended in another argument, one that grew sharp, cruel, and final. Mark had said he needed space. Emily had gone still, too still. And then she whispered, "If you walk away from me, you'll regret it." Those were the last words he remembered before everything went dark. According to the police report, the call came in at 12:47 a.m. A black SUV had slammed into a concrete barrier on Brookwood Drive. Rain poured over twisted metal, broken glass, and the faint pulse of a man fighting for his life. When paramedics arrived, they found Mark unconscious behind the wheel. The airbags hadn't deployed. The seatbelt was sliced clean through. And the passenger side door, Emily's door, was wide open. She was gone. No footprints in the mud, no signs of injury, no trace of another car. Just emptiness, and a trail of questions too dark to ignore. At first, police treated it as a tragic accident. They assumed Emily had gone for help or panicked and fled. But something about the scene didn't make sense. The steering wheel was twisted in an unnatural way. The car's internal system showed that the airbag sensors had been manually disconnected. And when detectives examined the cut seatbelt, they realized it wasn't torn in the crash. It had been sliced with a sharp blade before impact. That discovery changed everything. What looked like a tragic accident began to look like a setup. But with no eyewitnesses, no surveillance footage, and a missing passenger, the case was impossible to prove. Days turned into weeks. Emily resurfaced later, claiming she had been thrown from the car and knocked unconscious. She told police she woke up in a ditch and crawled home, too disoriented to call for help. Her tears convinced them, at least for a while. She stood by Mark's hospital bed, whispered apologies, and told everyone she'd never leave him again. Reporters called her the devoted girlfriend who refused to give up. But detectives who reviewed the evidence quietly wondered, if she truly loved him, why did she survive a crash she wasn't supposed to walk away from? And how did every safety feature in that car fail except for hers? Mark lay in a coma, trapped between life and death, unable to tell anyone what really happened. And Emily? She smiled for the cameras. She cried for sympathy. And she waited for him never to wake up. Days turned into weeks. Weeks bled into months. And still, Mark Evans lay silent. His body lived, but his spirit hovered somewhere between here and gone. Machines breathed for him, tubes fed him. The hospital became his world. White walls, sterile air, and the faint hum of monitors that whispered his survival. And every morning she came. Emily Rhodes, the loving girlfriend, the grieving partner, the woman the world now pitied. She brought flowers, always fresh, sometimes lilies, sometimes roses, always in white, as if mourning a man who wasn't yet dead. She sat beside his bed, held his hand, and whispered his name over and over, like she could call him back from the edge.
Doctors admired her devotion, nurses spoke softly about her strength, and in the local news she became a symbol of loyalty, the woman who refused to give up on love. But behind the closed door of room 214, things were different. She wasn't always the gentle visitor people saw. Some nights, she came when the lights were dim, her tone colder, sharper. A nurse once overheard her say through clenched teeth, "You should have just stayed gone, Mark." The nurse told herself she must have misheard. It had to be the grief talking. But when she mentioned it to her supervisor, the look she got back was simple. Don't get involved. Emily's devotion turned possessive. Every time the doctors talked about Mark transferring to a long-term facility, she objected. Every suggestion that he might eventually wake up seemed to unsettle her. And then came the incident. One night, a nurse entered the room unexpectedly to adjust Mark's IV. Emily jumped, quickly pulling her hand away from his neck. She smiled, said she was wiping his sweat, but the nurse couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Later, when the nurse checked the monitors, she saw a sudden drop in Mark's oxygen levels, followed by Emily calmly pressing the nurse call button, pretending to panic. The doctors chalked it up to a technical error, but the nurse knew better. And quietly, she began documenting everything: Emily's visits, her reactions, her words. Still, nothing could be proven. No evidence, no footage, just instinct. To the rest of the world, Emily was the picture of love, her tears sincere, her prayers endless. But to those who watched closely, there was something chilling in her calm. She never asked how he was improving. She only asked if he might remember. It became clear to a few that Emily wasn't waiting for Mark to wake up. She was waiting for him to never wake up. And for nearly 7 months, she almost got her wish, until the morning he opened his eyes and destroyed the story she had built around his silence. Because the woman the world believed was fighting for his life was the one who tried to take it. It happened on a Tuesday morning. The sky outside the hospital window was a pale, washed-out gray, quiet, unassuming, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The nurse on duty was checking Mark's vitals when she saw it, the slightest flicker in his eyelids. She leaned closer. His fingers twitched. His chest rose deeper than usual. And then, his eyes opened. For a moment, she froze. She whispered his name, unsure if she was dreaming. But when his gaze met hers, glassy and unfocused, she realized Mark Evans was awake. Within minutes, the hallway erupted in motion. Doctors rushed in. The head nurse shouted orders. Someone paged Emily Rhodes, who was downstairs in the cafeteria drinking coffee, just as she had done every morning for months. When Emily heard the words, "He's awake," the cup slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor. She stood still for several seconds, face blank, before whispering, "You're sure?" Then she ran. By the time she reached the room, the machines were beeping steadily, his heart rate climbing with effort. He looked pale, disoriented, but alive. Emily pushed through the small crowd of nurses and fell to her knees beside his bed. She touched his face gently, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Mark," she sobbed, "baby, you came back to me." For everyone watching, it was a miracle. Love triumphant, life restored. But then, he moved his lips. At first, it was just a whisper, hoarse, cracked, barely audible. The nurse leaned closer. "What was that, Mark?" His voice trembled, every word a battle against months of silence. And then came the sentence that would shatter everything. "She tried to kill me." The room went still. The air turned heavy, like the moment before lightning strikes. Emily froze, her face pale as snow. She let out a nervous laugh, the kind you make when you hope something isn't real. "Sweetheart, you're confused," she stammered. "You've been asleep a long time." But Mark wasn't done. His eyes locked on hers, trembling with fear and fury all at once. "She cut the seatbelt," he rasped. She wanted me dead." The nurse stepped back. The doctor glanced at the others, unsure what to do. And Emily slowly stood up, her trembling hands clenching into fists at her sides. "No," she said sharply. "He's hallucinating. He doesn't know what he's saying." But Mark's hand rose weakly, pointing straight at her. Tears rolled down his temples as he whispered again, "She tried to kill me." That was the moment everything changed. The miracle turned into a crime scene. The loving lover became the prime suspect. And the man everyone thought would never speak again had just spoken the truth. Within hours, police were contacted. Detectives reopened the case, this time not as an accident, but as attempted murder. And for the first time since that stormy night, the real story began to surface. One memory at a time, one truth at a time. Emily was no longer the grieving lover. She was the woman standing in a hospital room staring at the man she thought would never wake up and realizing her secret hadn't died with him.
The human mind has a way of protecting itself. It buries pain. It hides trauma behind locked doors, keeping the truth in the dark until the body is strong enough to face it. For weeks after waking, Mark Evans hovered in that fog between confusion and clarity. He couldn't tell what was real, what was memory, or what was nightmare. Doctors told him to rest, to focus on recovery, but the nightmares came anyway. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw headlights cutting through the rain, a flash of her face in the driver's seat, and then impact. The detectives were patient at first. They didn't want to push him too soon, but they needed answers, and Mark was the only one who could give them. It began with fragments, an argument, a phone vibrating, a text message that changed everything. Mark remembered sitting across from Emily at dinner the night of the crash. Her smile was tight, her laugh forced. When his phone buzzed, he saw her eyes flicker to it. Anger, then something darker. The text was from a colleague, harmless, just work. But Emily's face changed. Her voice dropped. "You think I don't see what's going on?" she hissed. He tried to calm her down, but she was already unraveling. In the parking lot, she snatched his phone from his hand, scrolling, accusing, crying. He'd seen her angry before, but this was different. Cold, almost rehearsed. And then, as the rain began to fall, she whispered something that burned itself into his mind. "You'll never leave me, not alive." The next memory came in flashes. The drive home, her silence, her hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly. The car speeding faster than it should have. His pleas for her to slow down met with nothing but that strange, steady calm. He remembered the road curving, the sound of tires skidding, his hand reaching for the seatbelt, only to find it loose, already sliced. Then she looked at him, no fear, no panic, just a small, hollow smile. And then she opened the door. Rain and wind rushed in. Her figure disappeared into the darkness. Seconds later, the crash. Then nothing. When Mark told detectives what he remembered, the room fell silent. Every word painted a clearer picture. It wasn't an accident. It was a plan. Detectives showed him photos from the crash site, twisted metal, shattered glass, and the severed seatbelt strap. Mark stared at it for a long time, his hand trembling as he whispered, "She cut it. She really cut it." With each recollection, more came flooding back. The insurance paperwork she'd asked him to sign, the strange calls she took late at night, the look she gave him days before the crash. Pity, not love. And then, something else. He remembered waking for a few seconds after the impact before losing consciousness again. He wasn't alone. Through the haze of pain and smoke, he saw her face leaning over him, whispering something he would never forget. "Sleep, Mark. Just sleep." It was no longer memory. It was confession. The detectives thanked him, but as they left his room, one of them turned to the other and said, "She didn't think he'd survive. Now, she's got a problem." Mark had survived her plan, and now, for the first time, he was strong enough to tell the truth that would tear apart everything she had built on his silence.
The moment Ethan spoke those 6 words, "She tried to kill me, Mom," the world around him shifted. The hospital room that had once been a sanctuary of hope turned into a crime scene in waiting. Nurses froze mid-step. His mother's trembling hands gripped his arm as she stared at him, pale and speechless. Doctors exchanged uneasy glances, whispering among themselves, as though the air had suddenly thickened with something unspeakable. And within hours, detectives arrived. Detective Laura Kane was the first to step through that door. Calm, calculating, the kind of woman who could read fear like it was written on skin. She'd seen hundreds of cases, but something about Ethan's eyes, the way they darted away when he said her name, told her this one would be different. She leaned closer to him, her voice soft but edged with suspicion. "Ethan, tell me everything you remember." And in that sterile white room, with the machines beeping and the smell of antiseptic thick in the air, Ethan began to speak. He told them about the fight they had that night, how Lily had become distant, secretive, how she'd started locking her phone, taking late-night drives, and snapping at simple questions. He told them how he confronted her about it, how her eyes turned cold, how she said words that still burned through his mind. "You'll regret ever doubting me." Then came the drive, the rain, the curve, and the flash of her hands shoving the steering wheel. But there was something more, a detail that made the detective's pen stop mid-scribble. Ethan remembered her smile. Not a scream, not panic, a smile. A calm, almost satisfied smile as his head hit the glass and everything went black. Detective Kane's pulse quickened. She ordered a forensic review of the crash site, something local police had brushed off months earlier. Back then, they'd written it off as an accident caused by bad weather. But when Kane's team returned, the story began to rot. The tire tracks didn't match Ethan's car's trajectory. The seatbelt on his side was cut clean, too clean for a crash. And in the passenger seat, where Lily had sat,
Fragments of glass embedded in her jacket pocket were traced back to the driver's window on his side. It was enough to raise one haunting question. Had she been driving when the car hit the tree, or had she switched seats after the crash? Kane followed the trail quietly, methodically, and every clue screamed manipulation. Lily had filed an insurance claim days after the accident, worth nearly $500,000. She'd sold Ethan's belongings, closed joint accounts, even deleted photos of them from social media, months before his coma ended. Every action painted her not as a grieving girlfriend, but as a woman closing a chapter she hoped would never reopen. And then a discovery chilled everyone in the investigation. A text message, recovered from Lily's deleted phone data, sent the night before the crash. It read simply, "Tomorrow everything changes. He'll never see it coming." Detective Kane stared at the words in silence. The case that began as a tragic accident had just become a potential murder attempt. But as the truth began to surface, Kane knew one thing. If Lily really tried to kill Ethan, she wasn't done yet. Because now, he was awake. And she knew it. And somewhere in the shadows beyond the hospital's sterile light, Lily was watching. Waiting. The game had only just begun. When Detective Kane summoned Lily to the precinct, the air itself felt heavier. It wasn't an arrest, at least not yet. It was what detectives call a conversation of clarity. But to Lily, it felt like Judgment Day. She arrived wearing black, too polished, too calm. Her hair was perfect, her smile controlled. If guilt had a face, it hid well behind hers. She walked into the interrogation room as if she owned the space, not realizing it was already closing in around her. Detective Kane watched her from behind the mirrored glass for a full minute before stepping in. She'd seen hundreds of liars before, but never one who seemed to enjoy it. "Lily," she said, her tone steady, almost kind. "Thank you for coming in. We just have a few questions about the night of the accident." Lily nodded softly, hands folded on the table, her eyes glistening like she'd rehearsed the moment 1,000 times. "Of course, Detective. Anything to help." But Kane wasn't here for help. She was here for truth.
She slid a photo across the table. Ethan in his hospital bed, pale and barely alive. Lily's eyes flickered for half a second, not with sadness, but with irritation. A tiny, almost invisible flash, like a mask slipping. Kane leaned in. "Ethan's awake." Lily's lips parted slightly, her voice faint. He woke up?" "Yes," Kane replied, "and he remembers everything." A stillness filled the room, so thick it almost hummed. Lily blinked once, twice, then smiled. That's wonderful," she whispered, but her voice cracked on the last word. Kane didn't smile back. She reached for another photo, this one a printout of the text message recovered from Lily's deleted phone. "Tomorrow, everything changes. He'll never see it coming." "Tell me, Lily," Kane said, her voice now a whisper laced with steel. "What was supposed to change that night?" For the first time, Lily's facade trembled. Her breathing quickened, her fingers began to tap, softly at first, then faster, desperate, restless. "That text, it wasn't about him, it was about me. I was leaving. I was done. You don't understand what he was like." Kane tilted her head slightly. "No, you don't understand. We found the insurance forms, the joint accounts you closed, the seatbelt that was cut. You planned something that night, Lily, and it wasn't leaving."
Lily's composure fractured. Her eyes turned cold, her voice sharper. "You think you know me, detective? You think he was some innocent victim? He was controlling, obsessed, paranoid. He made me feel trapped." Kane didn't move. "And so, you decided to kill him?" Lily froze. Her jaw clenched. "I didn't kill him." The words echoed in the small room, hanging there like smoke. Kane stood, slowly circling the table. "Then tell me why his seatbelt was cut, why your fingerprints were found on his side of the steering wheel, why he remembers you smiling as he hit the glass." Lily looked up sharply, her eyes dark and defiant now. "He was never supposed to wake up," she whispered. The words slipped out before she could stop them. Her hand flew to her mouth, eyes wide, heart racing. Kane stopped walking. Every officer behind the glass froze. It was the kind of confession that didn't need more words. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, real, fatal. Lily's shoulders sank. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You don't understand, Detective. If I couldn't have him, no one could." And with that, the woman who once seemed perfect, the one that Ethan had loved, trusted, and nearly died for, was led away into the shadows she created. And as that door shut behind her, the truth finally echoed through every corner of that precinct. Love had turned to obsession. Obsession had turned to violence. And a man who woke from death had spoken the words that finally brought the darkness into light.
The courthouse was silent that morning. Not the kind of silence that brings peace, but the heavy, suffocating quiet that comes before something breaks. Outside, reporters gathered in swarms, cameras flashing, voices shouting Lily's name as if she were some twisted celebrity. Inside, the air smelled of wood polish and fear. Every bench was filled, every eye fixed on the woman who had turned love into something deadly. Ethan sat in the front row, his body frail from months of recovery. His mother beside him, clutching a rosary so tightly her fingers were white. He didn't speak, didn't blink. He just stared at the woman he once called his future. Lily entered in handcuffs, head high, eyes empty. Gone was the charm, the grace, the careful control. Now she looked like a ghost of her former self, dressed in beige, drained of color, but still holding on to something dark within her. The prosecutor rose first, a man with a voice like a hammer, calm, deliberate, each word heavy with intent. He painted the story piece by piece, the financial motive, the insurance claim, the deliberate seatbelt cut, the message, tomorrow everything changes. And finally, Ethan's haunting words from the hospital bed, "She tried to kill me." Every sentence drove a nail deeper into the coffin of Lily's defense. But then came her turn. Her lawyer stood tall, weaving a narrative of manipulation and madness. He spoke of emotional abuse, of control, of fear. He claimed Lily had been a victim, trapped in a toxic relationship, driven to desperation. And for a brief moment, the room seemed uncertain. Some believed her, some wanted to. But then Ethan took the stand.
He rose slowly, every movement deliberate, fragile. When he looked at her,
The room seemed to shrink, just the two of them facing the ghosts of that night. His voice trembled at first, but then it grew steady, sharp, unbreakable. He told the jury about the laughter they shared, the promises, the dreams, and then the betrayal. The fear in her eyes that night wasn't fear of him, it was fear of getting caught. He described her hands on the steering wheel, the coldness in her stare, the final words she whispered before everything went black. "You'll never leave me." The courtroom was frozen. Even the air seemed to stop moving. Lily stared straight ahead, unblinking. No remorse, no apology. Just silence, the kind that tells you the monster has nothing left to say. When the judge finally returned with the verdict, it came down like a thunderclap. On the charge of attempted murder, guilty. The words echoed off the walls, rolling through the silence like a storm that had waited too long to break. Ethan closed his eyes. His mother wept quietly beside him. Lily didn't move. Her face remained blank as the judge read her sentence, 25 years in state prison. No emotion, no reaction, as if she'd already left her body long ago. As she was led away, her eyes met Ethan's one last time. A flicker of something, regret maybe, or defiance passed between them. And then she whispered, so soft it barely carried through the air, "You should have stayed asleep." The bailiff tightened his arm on her. The door closed, and with it, the last chapter of a love story that had turned into a nightmare finally ended. In the end, justice was served. But justice could never erase the scars, the ones on his body, and the deeper ones she left in his soul. Because when you wake from darkness and the first truth you hear is betrayal, you never sleep the same again. And for Ethan, his story became a warning whispered in the shadows, that sometimes the people who hold your hand in love are the same ones who'd watch you die in silence. The trial ended, but for Ethan, the story never really did. Because how do you move on from something like that? How do you heal from a love that tried to end you? Months passed. He returned to his small apartment, what was left of it. The walls still held photos of a life that no longer existed. Pictures of her smile, her eyes, her promises. He couldn't throw them away, not yet. They were proof that what happened was real. Every night, the same dream haunted him. The sound of tires screeching, the flash of her face, the smile before everything went black. He'd wake up drenched in sweat, gasping for air, convinced for a moment that he was still in that car, still trapped with her. Therapists called it survivor's trauma. But to Ethan, it was something deeper. Like his soul was still trying to crawl out of that wreckage. He walked with a cane now. The limp was permanent, a daily reminder of how close he came to death. But the real damage lived somewhere unseen, in the way he flinched when someone said her name, or how he avoided mirrors because they reflected not just his scars, but the truth of what he'd endured. Yet somehow, through all of it, he learned something that no courtroom, no verdict could ever teach. That evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears love's face. He spent his days speaking quietly at recovery groups, other survivors of abuse, betrayal, and near death. And though his voice shook, people listened. Because when you've walked through fire and survived, your words carry something that can't be faked. He never mentioned Lily's name again. Not once. But in every story he told, in every pause between his sentences, her shadow was still there. lingering just beyond the light. And so, Ethan lived on, not as a victim, but as a reminder. A reminder that love can save and love can destroy. That trust once broken leaves wounds no doctor can see. But most of all, that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always rise. Even from a coma, even from the edge of death. Because silence may protect lies for a while, but truth always finds a voice. If this story shook you, if it made you think about how fragile trust can be, remember, stories like this aren't just headlines, they're real. Real lives, real scars, real people who thought they were safe until they weren't. And there are many more stories like Ethan still hidden in the dark, waiting to be told. So, if you want to uncover more shocking true crime stories that reveal the darkest sides of love, betrayal, and survival, subscribe to Crime Vault. Because here, every heartbeat tells a story, and every story reveals a truth someone tried to bury.